In this video, we're going to think about the treadmill of consumption in a culture of consumerism and the environmental impacts that they have. So the first question we have to ask is, why do we consume so much? And there's a number of explanations for that. There's, of course, just good old fancy, old-fashioned greed. There are basic needs we have. Some consumption is actually necessary. People consume for status, to kind of show off, I guess. They consume for interest, sentiment, and community. Our emotions, our status, our basic needs, all bound up together in a ball with our consumption patterns. And why do we call it a treadmill? That's another good question. And that's because we often keep running faster, buying the latest, greatest object to keep up with the Joneses, to fulfill our needs. But usually it's a lot more than just meeting our basic needs. There's trying to be something more, and to a large degree it's a way of emphasizing our own identity. We used to define ourselves by what we produced, and now we define ourselves by what we consume. And of course, producers benefit from all this consumption, but we should note that the treadmill of production authors, the individuals responsible for creating treadmill of production theory, are not themselves as concerned about consumption, but nevertheless, we can point out that the treadmill of consumption helps feed the treadmill of production, and vice versa as well, because more consumption means more profit. So how do producers succeed in getting us to consume more? And a big part of that, of course, has to do with advertising and marketing, convincing us that a want is a need to a large degree. That's a big part of that. And advertising is a ubiquitous part of our culture, and it is woven into the fabric of the culture of consumerism. So what is this culture of consumerism? That's another thing that needs some definition, and it's just what it sounds like. There are several cultural icons that represent this idea, this notion of over-consuming. And George Carlin's bit on Stuff, the Veruca Salt character, and Charlie in the Chocolate Factory, all kind of speak to this notion of greedy consumption, just consuming for the sake of consumption. And we also consume, at times at least, when we buy something made in America, for instance, a lot of people feel like that's a patriotic act. So here again, we're weaving in our culture, our beliefs, our values through consumption. Our discussion of consumption will not be complete until we think about the role of technology, because technology is the object of our consumption many times. And culture helps define what technologies we should own, how we should rely on them, how we should organize ourselves to depend on them, and how we should build a lifestyle around these technologies. Bell and Ashwood, the authors of our textbook, talk about the phenomenology of technology. And the notion of phenomenology has to do with basic recipes or routines that we develop as ways to get through our day, and these eventually kind of just become autopilot. We go through life going through the motions, doing what we always do out of habit. And the notion that humans are creatures of habit is relevant to this notion of phenomenology of technology. And so we establish a series of routines with technology built into those routines. We don't even think about the use of the technology. But of course, for our interests, we're concerned because all this technology has environmental impacts, whether it be through energy consumption or through the manufacture of the technology, which has harmful byproducts, pollution and contamination, toxic waste. All of these things are relevant to technology. And the Bell and Ashwood notion of the social organization of convenience feeds right into this. So we build our communities, we build our societies in ways that integrate the technologies that we come to depend upon. So technology structures our lifestyle. We develop a need for certain technologies. I can recall a time when cell phones and smartphones in particular were not really a thing yet, and life seemed to manage along pretty well. There were payphones everywhere. Something that's changed, of course, those are mostly gone. And then a lot of how we interact with one another has changed. The norms of how people conduct themselves has changed. So culture has shifted to integrate the smartphone in particular, not just the cell phone, because the smartphone is a much more immersive experience. There's a lot more to do on a smartphone than on a good old-fashioned cell phone. And so we develop a passive response, passive technological politics, where we uncritically promote technological structures without really thinking through the impacts. So now let's turn a little more deeply to those questions of what drives our consumption, because this whole presentation kind of depends on consumption. We need to thoroughly understand what's driving it. And a lot of times discussions of consumption start with needs, and then there's something to the fact that human beings cannot survive without some level of consumption. We need food, we need clothing, basic housing and protection. And Maslow developed a hierarchy of needs pyramid that we'll look at momentarily that helps us understand where basic needs fall in relation to other needs. And at the bottom are the basic needs. And as we meet our lower needs, we move up through the hierarchy until we reach the tip of the pyramid, which is self-actualization. But essentially, one of the drawbacks of this pyramid, where we move up through the physiological needs, very basic physiological needs, through our safety needs, on up through our love and belonging needs, so sort of our emotional, cognitive needs, self-esteem, and then self-actualization, where we can develop a sense of morality and creativity, spontaneity, and so forth. But this doesn't tell us why people will buy, say, a $70,000 car over a $20,000 car. And certainly there's more to it than just the need to be transported. And that's where we have to think about Thorstein Veblen, sorry, not Max Weber. Thorstein Veblen gave us this notion of conspicuous consumption, which is the idea that we consume for an audience, that we're trying to promote our status through the objects that we consume. And people do that all the time when we buy objects for a premium that carry a certain logo and reputation, and kind of tell the world that you're somebody important if you own and consume that object. So it's a useful term, a useful theory, this idea of conspicuous consumption, for understanding the role of status and prestige. We also sometimes consume based on rational choice, but this is, of course, more of an exception. When people make large purchases, they're going to invest a lot of money. They often will develop a pro and con list to become very systematic. But if you've ever been to a grocery store and you've looked at the objects located at the cash register, you'll note that when those are purchased, it's not usually out of rationality. It's out of a spontaneous impulse. And so it turns out, a lot of what we consume is derived from a more, I guess, psychological stimulus response kind of dynamic. And that's where advertising comes in. And at one point, advertisers were misled into thinking that the best route to get people to buy products was by appealing to rationality, by kind of emphasizing the pros over the cons of certain products, and instead of appealing to maybe emotion or other types of things. Sentiment is a more powerful motivator than rationality. If you can get people to feel an emotional attachment to a product, to an object, then they are more likely to feel the need to own that, because they'll want to feel the emotions that come with the ownership or consumption of that product. And of course, sex sells, and sex really just another form of stimulus response. Uh, and so associational advertising will pair a product with some kind of image, and that image will, of course, elicit a response in the intended audience. Beyond that, people will consume because they are lonely, because they feel a sense of void in their lives. Wachtel theorizes that human beings have forever lived in some kind of communal situation, groups, tribes, agricultural villages for thousands of years, and we live in a time when urbanization in particular has led to a greater level of individuality, and that has some advantages to be sure, but it's also potentially leading to feelings of loneliness, a lack of community and belongingness. Even that finds its way into Maslow's hierarchy, the sense of belongingness. And so that makes us vulnerable to advertisers who would exploit that and really kind of pair up a product with the feeling of community or belongingness. And that's a common tactic as well. And so people wind up consuming beyond what they can afford. They work extra long hours in order to pay off their credit cards or try to close the gap on their spending. And Shore theorizes that this becomes a work and spend cycle. The more we work, the more we spend. The more we spend, the more we work. And so it goes back and forth. And people wind up sacrificing holidays, vacations in order to close the loop. They work longer hours per day. They work into the weekend. And in the act of working, become more and more isolated from their family, friends, and neighbors. That feeling of isolation and loneliness further fuels the need to consume, and the need to consume further fuels the need to work. And you can see that's sort of a treadmill, isn't it? So I think that is a useful corollary idea to this notion of a treadmill of consumption. So some questions, can buying things really replace those sentiments that come from being lonely and not having community? Can we buy happiness? Well, whether or not that's true, certainly people try, and that is one of the main engines of the treadmill of consumption. And as long as we can continue consuming at such a high rate, we will continue using up materials that are going to have environmental impacts, and that's of course the ultimate concern that we're addressing with this presentation. So, concluding thoughts: a treadmill of consumption, a metaphor for moving ahead materially when we actually are staying in place in terms of our satisfaction and happiness. We consume for a variety of reasons, but a lot of it is not motivated by rationality or need, much of it by prestige seeking or filling a void of some kind, and the implications, of course, are greater material inputs and throughputs through the manufacture of a wide range of products that we buy. And what does it get us? It doesn't really get us anywhere in terms of quality of life or anything else. And that will wrap up our discussion of the treadmill of consumption.